am going to sit down, but before I sit down and address our panelists, I have to acknowledge a certain degree of awkwardness and apologize in that I'm a man and that we're going to be talking about extraordinary women. And so I think it's because of the Aspen Institute connection that your organizers have asked me to have the privilege of moderating this panel. They may also know that I'm the father of 6 daughters, so I'm so I'm used to being around women who are much smarter than I am and always, well, I won't go on. But let me bring up our panelists. Please just come up, and as they come up, I'll tell you a little bit about them. We have a limited amount of time, and they are remarkable women. I think many of you have already read a great deal about them on the website. You'll be hearing more. We're having another extraordinary woman who's going to be joining us. I'll say a little bit about her. But given the fact that there are many people, far more than are in this room, who are watching this right now, we wanted to get started. In the middle, right now, we have Olga Kudynenko. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her. She has done an absolutely remarkable job building one of the most respected charitable organizations in Ukraine, and really a model for many other countries around the world. The organization is called Choki.
I never thought it would be international.
Yes, when she started it, she didn't realize it would have such great international implications that she might have found something a little bit easier for non-Ukrainian or non-Russian speakers to pronounce. But it does amazing things with children who are suffering from cancer. And to my immediate left is Ala Murabit, who, again, I'm just privileged to be here on the same stage, whose work around the world is focused on the critical area of women's health and reproductive freedom. We were just chatting briefly before our session tonight, and I started by saying, many people say when they're gathering about many of the problems facing the world that there's no such thing as a silver bullet, which may be an expression that's not universally understood, but there's essentially meaning that there's no single thing that if you use it, you can solve myriad problems. Well, I said, and she immediately knew what I was going to say and agreed that no, that's not in fact true. There is in fact a silver bullet, and that silver bullet is educating and elevating girls. And if you extend that to assuring healthy lives for women and reproductive freedom, as we will also hear, you can see that it has implications for everything. So let me just say just one other thing. I also want to thank Victor, because he's not only a sponsor of this wonderful gathering and this facility and the role here. Ah, wonderful, and here we have, welcome, June. June Sarpong has just arrived from Ghana via London. It's not necessarily easy to get here. We're delighted to have you. And for anyone who spent any time watching British television, her face will be very familiar. Really one of the leading presenters, news anchors in the United Kingdom. She's interviewed some of the most famous people in the world. And she has also co-founded empowerment conferences and written many books on inclusion, the power of women, and the importance of diversity in all respects. And we're absolutely delighted you came so far to be here with us.
Thank you.
So, just one other thing about the connection that Alexa and I have, and I'm very sorry that one person who would have been here to make some remarks, I consider someone who could sit on this same stage too, and that is the head of the Aspen Institute in Ukraine. We call it Aspen Kyiv, and that's Yulia Tichkivska. And I think many of you may know Yulia. She was one of the co-founders of the Open University on the Maidan. And she's a young woman of just extraordinary power. And like these young women, she never takes no for an answer. Everything she wants to achieve, she does. She just is a power of nature. But I think maybe it's telling that she's not here tonight, which is still a challenge that women have, and I must say more than men have. Her young daughter was hospitalized a few days ago. She'll be fine, and so she needs to be in the hospital with her daughter. Otherwise, she would be here with us as well. The last thing I will say about the power of women and empowering women, there's a word that's been created recently, and we often make reference to it at the Aspen Institute. And I should possibly mention the irony of being from the Aspen Institute. We put on something called the Aspen Ideas Festival, which many people analogize to what is happening here in Davos. They sometimes call it the American Davos. We prefer to think of Davos as the European or global Aspen. But we put on many programs for the public and for invited guests. And we have a rule now against ever having something we called a manel. Do you know what a manel is? No. A manel is a panel with nothing but men on it. And no, seriously, and when you think about it, how often do you go to conferences and convenings on any topic? It could be on men's, urological health, and you still never see a woman, but you need to see women. So we now have a rule that we never have a panel without women on it, and ideally even numbers of women. And it's gone to be a sort of a movement where, and I'm not suggesting you do this here this week, but if you do, don't blame me. That people actually complain when a panel is put together and it's nothing but men. Because, for example, even in the area of something like, we have a big conference that we put on national security, on defense and military issues, which you would think, and truthfully, people today largely are men who are generals and admirals and ministers of defense. But we apply the same rule there. We will not have a panel that doesn't have women on it. And the message is so important, especially to women, especially girls in the audience. And you just think about what it's like if you go to major events all the time and you're sitting there and you're a young girl and you want to be a general, or you want to be a doctor, or you want to be a president, or you want to be a philosopher, whatever it may be, and there's a panel of people talking to you about it, and there are no women on it. So it is a very important thing to do, and I urge all of you to ban manels in any context in which you can possibly work. So let me start with you, Alla. With all your activism, you seem to address every one of the United Nations, 17 development goals. Are you conscious of that? Do you try to connect the dots in some way? Are they all connected, or are there some things that you prioritize in what you do?
So I'm actually very glad you mentioned security. My company actually focuses on security and security cooperation. That's what I specialize in. I'm a medical doctor by background. When I was 21, I founded an organization that focused specifically on women's inclusion in security processes in Libya. Was asked then to advise the Security Council on Resolution 1325, which is Women, Peace, and Security. And from there went on to co-found a company that advises governments around the world, a lot of those admirals and chiefs of staff, and ministers of defense, on how they can best ensure security cooperation, inclusive security, and sustainable security. Because, the unfortunate reality is 90% of our peace processes fail within 5 years. That's the unfortunate reality. The silver lining is we've begun to figure out what we can do differently. Now, if we include women, how much longer do peace processes last? Does anybody have the answer for me? They are 35 times more likely to last 15 years. It's an incredible difference. So a lot of my work in women's reproductive rights, or a lot of the work I do on girls' education, I sit on the board of the Malala Fund, or a lot of the work we do on elevating and amplifying local leaders and their voices, because often when it does come to international engagement, we do neglect to recognize that that local voices need to architect the projects, or they're just not going to work. They're not going to be sustainable. So a lot of that comes from my work in peace and security, and the recognition that if we're really talking about peace building, not in an essence of stopping bullets and stopping a war, but if we're talking about actually building a nation, those are fundamentally different things. And we know empirically that healthcare, social services, education, we know that those are the hallmarks of a successful nation, and that's where the Sustainable Development Goals come in. Now, when we look at what countries we're worried about insecurity in, the single best indicator, best in the world, who has a guess for whether or not a country will devolve into conflict, internally or externally? What do you think the best indicator is?
Number of women in leadership roles.
Well, come on, you can't cheat. Normally people are like GDP, I don't know. Like, really? They were supposed to be like X Factor here. You're killing it for me. So yes, it is. It's actually the devolution of women's rights internally. So the more, and as how drastically we see it. So if you see a sudden decrease in women's inclusion and women's rights, it is something that we genuinely watch out for. We start going, wait a second, this is a problem. More so than GDP, more so than territory conflict or resource conflict. So when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, they're inherently interconnected, because we can't have Goal 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, if we don't have girls' education. We can't have quality healthcare if we don't have girls' education. We can't alleviate poverty if we're not providing economic opportunities. We can't provide economic opportunities if women and girls are not being educated, right? And there are often times in meetings, someone will say, well, we're focusing only on climate change. And I'm like, well, what are you guys doing? Like, we have all this sexy new energy. We're going to this conference. We're going to send someone to Mars. I'm like, fantastic. Guess what the most cost-effective and practical solution towards climate change is in the world? Girls' education and women's reproductive rights. Not established by a bunch of women's rights activists, but established by climate scientists in a book which I recommend everybody read called Drawdown by Paul Hawken. The reality is, if we really want to move towards inclusion, sustainable development, growth, nation building, citizen-state trust, it really does come down to the requirement that we have to have women in leadership roles. But before we can start tasking women to be in leadership roles, we have to ensure they have education and healthcare. We have to ensure that there are basic services and necessities are met.
Well, that's a wonderful way to start.
She's only clapping because she got the answer right.
No, you can't answer any more questions, though. Olga, let me ask a question of you that I think is one that probably many young women who see injustice or see suffering and want to not just do something, but lead something that's going to make a difference. And, you go around and you tell people, there are all these children who are suffering from disease or not being educated or living in poverty, whatever the case may be. And most people you talk to say, well, I can't really help, or why do you want to do that? Or you ask them for money, or you ask them for an office, or you ask them to come to a meeting, and they say no. I assume you had that experience, and I assume that you somehow overcome that experience. So what is it that you do? What is it that you reach down for when you keep being told, no, it won't work, you have better, do something else, you can't make that happen, whatever. How do you react to that to accomplish what you do?
I will start with the statistics. When a child died from cancer, the world lost 72 years of life. And when I tell this to people, they're just, oh no, it cannot be. Maybe this child will be alcoholic or, I don't know, drug dealer. And I replied, okay, maybe, but he can be an engineer, or he can be a new Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever. And when I see when I hear no as an answer, I became more angry. I want to work more because I know that every person in this room and everywhere can help. We just need to find right words and to motivate them to divide their time, money, or their spirit. When I started my work, I was only 23 years old, and nobody believed that a young lady without anyone behind her back can do this. And everyone told me, oh, I know, some oligarchs, politics, people in power or from governance or whatever are staying behind you and helps you. And they're going to use your brand and your charity in some bad way. But after 7 years, when they see how many children survived from cancer and how many people received help and how the culture of charity in Ukraine has been changed, they're impressed. And when I show people that actually topic of the day in Ukraine has been changed because of our charity, they want to help and they want to participate in charity at all. I know that after our work, after a lot of no's, we started a new I think population of charities. A lot of charities has been opened and followed our way. So we changed the attitude in the country.
I mean, that's such a wonderful story. So it's not just you have been empowered by that, but you have given examples to so many others that it can be done. And especially, maybe in a culture where there isn't that charitable tradition and people see that it can work.
Yes, when they see our transparency, our results, and see real children who received help and who beaten cancer, they want to make something good around them.
Well, thank you. And June, we're so delighted you made it here.
Thank you.
And as June was a late entry, some of you may not know, in addition to her broadcasting fame, as I said, she's written a number of books. She co-founded a major conference on women's empowerment. She's an ambassador of the Prince's Trust, and she's on the board of an organization in Soweto in South Africa that provides food to children in schools. She also, and maybe you should be going back to London, she's active in the Remain campaign. And I think at some point before the evening's out, we're going to ask you what in the world is going to happen. No one has any idea. But let me ask you about a different kind of prediction, and that is from your perspective, which is really a global perspective. It seems, and it's a little bit like, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty on issues relating to women and women empowerment. It seems, I mean, as an American, 2 years ago, with the loss of Hillary Clinton and many of the policies that we see now, particularly on reproductive health and the like, it seems like we are moving backwards. With a rise of what you might call sort of patriarchal populism around the world, it's looking like we may be moving backwards. Where do you think the needle is at the moment, and what gives you hope and optimism?
Yeah, well, having just returned from Ghana, where I was in the northern part of the country, which is the poorest part, and the government recently introduced universal education. And this is a region that traditionally has not sent its girls to school. And in the last 2 years, 95% of the girls are now in school. And the project I was working with really works to empower them, but also their parents, so they understand why education matters for their daughters as much as it does for their sons. And to see, and I went to that region, is this me or is that me? Hello? Yeah. Ish.
She's one person who's used to microphones.
Yes, still the same. I went to that region. Should I try without?
No, because it's being broadcast.
Oh, they're filming. Is the sound man doing the magic for us?
Can we? There's some feedback somewhere. Oh, maybe to the speaker. Could someone come up and move the chair? Maybe that's it.
Is that better? Yeah, brilliant. And I went to that region 15 years ago. Oh.
I think we need to move the speaker. I think that's probably the source. Could someone just, either that, let's try this. Let's each move our chair a few feet to the right. Let's see if that's the magic.
How's that? Yes! We have liftoff. I went to that region 15 years ago, and what I've seen in that time is night and day. So that definitely energizes me and excites me. And also, I think when you look at what's going on at the moment, it may seem as if we're moving backwards, but actually I think it's the reverse. I think what's happened is now there's been a reckoning, whether that be Me Too, Time's Up, whether that be pay transparency and equal pay, all of the issues we've had around that, particularly in the West. I think what's happening now is we are sort of picking apart just how unequal things have been, and people are sort of venting, but we're now moving to the solutions part. And I think if you look at the conversations, this conversation would not have been happening 5 years ago. It wouldn't. You wouldn't have you moderating a panel of 3 women talking about why we need to make sure that gender parity is the norm. And so for me, I think it's moving forward, and I think when you talk particularly to younger women, they're just not having it. And actually what's exciting is the men also get it too. So I think 10 years from now, we're going to see big changes. So for me, I'm definitely optimistic. And,
well,
and also, look, we lost Hillary, but Kamala Harris announced today. So
yeah, well,
who knows?
Actually, yes, just on that. And I have to say, I'm very optimistic, too. And it's not just because I have 6 daughters.
Good for you, lucky man.
But if you look at millennial attitudes, they're so different. And male millennial attitudes are so different. And yes, it looks like we'll have 5 women running for president in the United States. We just elected more women to Congress than any time in history.
Nancy Pelosi is certainly rocking it at the moment, isn't she?
Yeah, Aspen is nonpartisan,
of course,
so I have to be careful what I say, but I agree with you.
Yes.
So let me ask a couple of different questions of all of you about some of the challenges. Let's see. We'll just cuddle up here. So, some of the challenges that one often hears among women activists or women looking at progress like this is there a conflict between what you might call sisterhood and leadership? Sometimes one hears many of the critics of women in leaders seem to be women who are unhappy with other women taking positions of leadership that traditionally might have been men's positions. And then there was this famous comment, maybe not famous here, but it's famous in the United States at the time. Madeleine Albright, our Secretary of State, who's also on the board of the Aspen United States, said there's a special place in hell for women who don't help women. And that was in the context of the fact that I think a majority of the white women in the United States did not vote for Hillary Clinton. So do any of you have a perspective on that particular problem, the resentment that at least some women seem to have to maybe each of you? I mean, do you sometimes feel that women have a problem with your leadership in a way that's surprising? I mean, maybe not.
Well, I just think, and I'm sure both of you will have opinions on this, I think the problem with the patriarchy is it means it creates an environment where the majority of people are suspicious of female power and female leadership, and internalized misogyny is real. But in saying that, I think if you look at the Hillary Clinton result and you look at what happened in Congress and you look at the midterm results, we've seen a big shift. So actually, if you look at educated women, educated white women, more of them voted for the women this time round, and I think you're going to see that in 2020. So I definitely see a shift happening. And it's a process. We've been conditioned for so long to look at any woman who's in power with some sort of suspicion and to think that perhaps she's there to, bring men down and she's there not to support other women. I think that's changing.
So I think there's a couple of things. I'm going to first touch base on the Hillary Clinton white women thing, because more white women still voted for Ted Cruz. So I still think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think looking at it only in the silo
But the numbers are shifting.
Right. But looking at it only in the silo of sex, of women, doesn't work anymore. I think we have to start looking at it in the silo, in retrospect of, okay, so what are minority women doing? What is the difference? Because there's a fundamental difference. And I don't think it's appropriate that white women are the barometer for the level of women's rights in a country anymore. It just doesn't work. You cannot be a multicultural country and deem that because white women voted, then suddenly women's rights is combative or it's regressive. What we've seen with minority women has been groundbreaking. When we talk about the influx of women in Congress, when we talk about who emboldened and raised those voices and got people marching, it's been minority women. They've led the charge. And I think that's what's hopeful about America. It's, to me, millennial guys, to be quite honest, they're also the biggest recruits for white supremacist groups. You can go both ways
you
there.
You have to look at demography on that, though.
Right, you do have to look at demography, but we also have to look at the reality that a lot of the people who are now voting for I think, very controversial and oftentimes racist measures voted against Vietnam in the 70s, right? People's political opinions change as they age. People do get, for the most part, statistically, more conservative. We see that them getting more fiscally. So I don't think millennials are the be-all and end-all. I think it is cultivating an ecosystem where women who have often been ignored from the conversation are leading the conversation. And what we've seen with Alexandra Cortez, what we've seen with Ayanna Pressley, what we've seen with all of these women is that they led locally. They delved into their local communities. They got a lot of local support and credibility, and that has manifested within the states. So I think that's very important on that front. In terms of the minority politics of women, listen, I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters. There's 11 kids in my family. And my brothers, I am sure there are guys who are jealous of them too. Women, it just keeps, when we talk about women, there are so few women in positions of power that a lot of that internal debate is amplified to make women look more divisive and weaker. And I think we have to recognize that a lot of that is just the reality of minority politics, the assumption that there's only one spot at the top and only one of us gets it, and that's perpetuated by society as a whole. And a lot of the reason that we see it more difficult for women to support other women is because they are told that women aren't as capable. The best example I can give is during the Libyan Revolution when we approached women survivors of sexual violence. And we wanted to speak to them and work with them and see how we could help. And a lot of the survivors said, in a conservative culture, I'd prefer a man. And I would ask why. They'd prefer a male doctor. And they would say, well, because you're like me, what can you do? And so there is this assumption that we fit the roles that we have. And I think we have to be cognizant that unless we start elevating, amplifying the roles and the voices of women in positions of power, we're going to continue to perpetuate this stereotype and this norm that women are not capable of leadership.
Olga, what are your views about this? It seems universal. It's not just certain cultures where, although there's certainly a variation among cultures, where women in political leadership, if they're perceived as bossy or aggressive, it's a negative, whereas a man is expected to be strong and aggressive and assertive. Do you see this?
Exactly. I would like to support Ally's word about women who doesn't support each other. And exactly, I would like to tell my own case. When I started my foundation, as I told, I was 23 years old. And everyone saw that someone behind my back. And then they started to make investigations to find out who is that. And then when they didn't find, they started to ask me questions like, oh, do you have a child? And I told, no, I don't have. So you cannot be sincere to your work. You cannot understand problems of the families who has children with cancer because you are not a mom. When I gave a birth to a child 3 years ago, everyone started to ask me, "Oh, you're leaving your own child to work for other children whom you even don't know. What a mother are you?" Oh, wow. And everyone is trying to blame me if I have a child or if I don't have it. And they're trying to connect my maternity to my work. And I see it everywhere. People, and especially women, have so high demand to each other's and so high standards that you should be a great mother, you should be a great professional. And if you are a great professional and if you are doing your work good, someone should support you. Who are paying for your bills? Where do you have money? I see it everywhere in Ukraine. And actually also I see that like Ukrainian background, that women should stay at home and do all homework is all time like it's a conflict with your career, because you cannot explain why you have someone at your home who are working and you are not doing your job everywhere. It's so hard to be like everywhere.
Please, Alan.
I do hope that we can change this question and change this conversation. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. But I do hope we can start asking which women have empowered you and amplified you and emboldened you to be in the position of power you're in. Because while, yes, some women may not 100% always support each other,
so many do.
It is an overwhelming reality and truth for me, at least, that I would not be here had it not been for women. Not in the abstract sense of they built the foundations of the platforms that we sit on and we stand on the shoulders of giants. If you are a woman in leadership today, it's because other women took that risk before you, but also in the practical day-to-day sense of women leverage their networks, their resources, their reputations, their support systems, their credibility so that I could be in positions of power. So I think we need to begin to ask, how have women gotten you to the position you're in as well?
And just to add to your point, you're completely right. I just finished some work with a group in the UK called The Pipeline, looking at the FTSE 100 and particularly at the executive committees. And what we found is that women leaders, on average, hire 50% more women than male leaders. So what you're saying is completely right. If you look at the data in reality, women leaders bring up other women.
Let's stay on that for a minute. And most of that data that I'm familiar with are at medium ranks in companies, in part because there still seems to be a glass ceiling for women. And here we are in Davos, and we have many CEOs here. They're still overwhelmingly male. Boardrooms are overwhelmingly male. And what do you think will change in corporate behavior if we see more women in the C-suite, on the boards, and in the corner office? Will business still operate the same way? Will shareholders still benefit the same way? Or are we going to see some perhaps paradigm shifts in even how people think of the role of the corporation or the role of the business as women ascend? Yeah. What do you each think?
I think Paul Pullman actually is a really good example here. For Unilever is a very good example because he said publicly that it was not this moralistic sense of women's rights that convinced him to put women in positions of leadership and power at Unilever. It was more he was getting better returns. And it was just, it made sense. It was logical. Another really good example for this is General Fig Leaf in the United States. He used to be a former head of Pacific Command, former acting commander, who also said the same thing. He said, listen, it wasn't a moralistic, I'm not going to go into a war zone and put women in positions of authority because of morals. I'm going to do what makes the most sense and what keeps my men safe. And it was having more inclusive security services. So I think what we're actually going to see is that more inclusive, more diverse corporations are doing better financially. We've seen that with Nike recently. We've seen that with Unilever for the past 10 years. And even with 10,000 Women by Goldman Sachs, this recognition that there's a lot of data being built up for the importance of women's inclusion in leadership positions within the economy.
I'd actually like to take that a step further. And what you're saying is women, and you're not saying exactly this, but maybe you're saying women are going to be just as effective leaders of corporations by traditional standards. But what if, and this week there are going to be many conversations around this town about what's wrong with capitalism and how can capitalism improve because of increasing public unhappiness. And one of those questions is the role of the corporation. Is the corporation's sole purpose to maximize shareholder value, or in fact, does it have obligations to the community and many other things?
Totally.
And I happen to think they do. And there are many people who think that women, for various reasons, are going to be more sensitive to those additional obligations. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. And also, I think, picking back up on your point, not only is it financially the smart thing to do, but actually, if you want to be a company that is sustainable for the future and future-proof your business, in terms of impact, the consumer's going to expect it. And I think that what's going to be really interesting is as we see more and more women actually step into leadership roles and feel comfortable in those positions to actually completely create a new paradigm. This is the type of stuff we're going to see becoming much more normal. Because up until now, women have been the minority, and therefore they've had to fit in and basically do what the men have done. And I think what we're going to see now is a new way of a new form of leadership and a new way of company growth. And companies will benefit, and the ones that don't won't survive.
And I do want to emphasize it's not solely about women's inclusion. No. I think we have to be very clear that this isn't solely about women's leadership, it's about inclusive leadership. Yes. The way that capitalism can be, I think, sustainably challenged, the way that corporations can be sustainable moving forward is by inclusive leadership, leadership that represents the communities they're working in. So that naturally means, yes, women will be included. It also means looking at, if you look at our executive boards, how many of them are actually going through the struggles of paying their grocery bill? Or how many of them are going through the struggle of paying for internet? Or how many, so we have to begin to ask ourselves, both in politics and the economy, if we're looking at sustainable leadership, it has to be a lot more inclusive. It does.
Olga?
I want to say that in US, third sector of economics is a charity one, is NGOs, and 70% of employees in NGOs are women. So we can see that it's the third sector of economic, and so many women are there, and I'm pretty sure if it will be a lot of women in other sectors, they will be sustainable and can change a lot in the world.
Yeah, I think the question every corporation needs to ask itself is everyone in the room? And if everyone isn't in the room, why not? And what can you do to address that?
Well, we have everyone in the room, and we now give all of you a chance to ask some questions in the time that we have left. And do we need to have a microphone? Who here? You can happily have one of ours. Do we spread microphones? Yes, we have. So if you can, in the time we have left, yes, there's a young woman in the second row.
Hello, my name is Irina, and I'm really excited by your panel, not Menel. And I really ask, do you think that there is some sphere where men are not so good like women?
I can answer. I can answer. It's a psychological... psychological research that show that for men it's really hard to work with emotional spheres like childhood cancer. And if you see like reports, there are a few men who can work in NGOs and support children during their cancer treatment. And if we have awful statistics that show that men are leaving the families when child is sick.
So I'm actually going to say no. And the reason I say that is I think it's a lot less about gender as much as it is about the norms and the qualities that we place on people, so masculinity and femininity. And I think that socially men have been told that they are ill-equipped to perform certain duties, and they've been given permission to neglect those duties. And I think what I'm seeing now, particularly with like these pushes for paternal leave and this push for men to be more, is a lot of men are saying, no, gender equality helps us too. We want to do this. We want to be involved. We're as emotionally capable. So I don't think there's anything. As a doctor, I can say biologically there isn't, but I fundamentally don't think there's anything. I think when you tell, it's like when you're a parent and you tell one of your kids they're a black sheep, they're going to start behaving like they're the black sheep because they're already being punished. So they may as well. And I think when we say, well, men can't do this, we're giving young men an excuse to say, well, like, it's in my DNA, you can't do this. So I think what we need to start saying is, no, everybody can do this, and we need to, in leadership, embrace feminine qualities of leadership, or what are traditionally feminine qualities of leadership, like compassion and listening, as much as we embrace what are traditionally male qualities of leadership.
Let me just jump in with a question. I was just reading something yesterday that was very interesting on this, and about how boys are brought up, and the expectations boys have and girls have. And for example, working with children with cancer, I mean, many young men are taught that they can't cry. And it's very difficult to be around children who may be dying and not cry.
Exactly.
But what one reads is, in many cases, women are actually contributing to this problem with attitudes they show to their children, where they might excuse boys' behavior. Well, boys will be boys. And have certain expectations. So it's a matter of, generational change here.
Well, and as we saw in the Gillette ad,
Yes.
it's becoming...
I don't know if people here have seen
exactly.
it. Exactly.
It's becoming something that even the brands are realizing they need to challenge. Just to your point, I think the thing that we have to sort of, as women, as we rise, what we have to make sure we get across is the fact that this is not a zero-sum game. So if women succeed, that does not mean that men fail. Actually, what we're doing is we're creating something new, something bigger. And I think a really good example of it is back to what you were saying about in the home. If you look just in a generation, I'm sure your father probably didn't change nappies. Whoever you partnered with, there's no way you would accept that. Yeah, right? And that's in one generation. Just, that's something as simple and as anecdotal as that. And I think that's what we're going to see happening in the workplace in reverse. So, no, we are not better, we're equal, but the idea is to create a framework where actually all of our talents can be nurtured.
And I do think as we see more women in positions of power and more men take on more domestic roles, we're going to see a change even in the ecosystem that contributes to it. So a good example is changing rooms in men's washrooms. A lot of them never happened until a man went in with his baby and said, I had to change my baby on the floor. Like, what are you guys doing? And I think as we see that shift, a lot of our institutions and a lot of our industries are going to have to shift with
that.
Do we have another question? I know we have lots of people outside, and we're going to break for refreshments here again in a minute, but I want to make sure people have a chance. This is a pretty remarkable group of women. So someone must have... Yes, back here. And if you could wait for the microphone.
Yes.
So I have a question around, you were mentioning about your consultancy for peace process. And do you have an example that you can share with us just around some of your recent work and what you've been focused on?
So we did a lot of work in the recent peace processes in Colombia, and I think the best example I can give across the board, something that we have seen statistically backed up multiple times, but it was the first time I had that personal experience with it, is that it's not simply about inclusion, it's about inclusion at the agenda setting phase. So you cannot bring women in after the agenda's been set. You cannot bring minorities in after the agenda's been set, because they're only going to be able to discuss from point A to point C. So if they're not there at the agenda setting phase, it's honestly almost like they weren't there at all. They have to exist within the parameters of a discussion that's already been set for them. Another good example I can give is we were in Bangladesh quite recently, and Bangladesh has done some outstanding work in terms of women's engagement in peace and security, and they've had to do quite a bit of heavy lifting with the recent Rohingya crisis. And this is why I think women's reproductive rights is so intimately connected to peace and security. There was an influx of about 400 to 500,000 Rohingya refugees within the space of 2 months. And they set up camp on elephant stomping grounds, so very insecure territory. There was very limited resources. There's not a lot of, geopolitical goodwill to handle the situation. Nobody really wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And what was remarkable was when we went into those communities wanting to talk about security within those camps, because camps do have an increasing rate of sexual violence and insecurity, a lot of the women were like, no, wait a second, we want to talk about vaccines for our kids. Like, we want to talk about what we've been told. We have all these health organizations coming in telling us about vaccines and all these things they didn't have before, but nobody's actually bringing them to us. And so there was a lot of turmoil within the camp of, are you saying our kids aren't as important as other kids? Like, we're giving us all these pamphlets, so what's going on? And so it was my first time seeing how important services are to building trust and maintaining trust. Because they'd been given all these, like, UN pamphlets about vaccines, but then nobody was showing up to vaccinate their kids. And they were being told the importance of having their homes, and all they were given was a tarp and some rope and told to build it. So it was very interesting to see how quickly trust actually was decimated between the international community and the local community, because they were being told all these things that were never delivered to them. And that often happens in conflict. A lot of NGOs parachute in. Yep. They all make a lot of promises. When they realize the resources are running out, or it's politically not necessarily a political dream, they all parachute out. And there leaves a huge black hole there of insecurity and distrust, and that's where we see a lot of non-state actors gaining a lot more power. So those are probably the best two examples.
Another question? I can't see people behind this bureau, but on this side? Over here in the back. Ah, great. We have a question from a man.
Hi, I'm Jim Brook, Ukraine Business News. 7 years ago, it seems like a different lifetime, I was in your native Libya. It was a very hopeful period because Gaddafi had been pushed out of Tripoli. And then it never happened. And I was wondering, in terms of the participation of women in the peace process, or anybody in the peace process, why hasn't that worked? And why haven't women been able to assert themselves and be involved?
It's interesting. The term assert themselves puts a lot of the onus on the women. Yeah. And the reality is, it's not a one-trick pony, right? Women can't just say, hey, we're going to show up. They did that. Libyan women did that. They showed up. And unfortunately, there are significant structural realities that limit the participation of women, not just in Libya, but in most peace processes. And a very good example of that, and something that played out overwhelmingly in Libya, is this assumption that women's rights and security are not intertwined. So almost the entire international community, when it came to women's engagement, and when we were knocking on the door saying women need to be engaged, was saying, let us figure out the peace situation, let us figure out the security, the ceasefire, and then we'll talk about women's rights. As if the two are not inherently connected and dependent on one another. And it was very difficult. It continues to be very difficult to talk to people in leadership positions. I mean, we have less than 7% of our negotiators globally are women. Less than 4% of mediators are women. And so, and oftentimes there's that kind of like tape measure of, we're going to put a gender advisor in, as though that has the same level of credibility and leadership and authority that the SRS, the special representative of the Secretary General in a political mission has, and it just doesn't, right? So from an international perspective, there wasn't enough. From a local perspective, there wasn't interest. A lot of your local political power players did not want women engaged because it meant they would have power taken away from them, which is expected. But from an international level, that was reinforced by a lot of international actors saying, listen, we don't need to focus on women right now, or we can have women in the separate room and go between the two rooms as though that's some sort of solution. And I think the additional challenge there is, as I was mentioning, that parachute effect. Once it became so insecure that a lot of the embassies left the country, that black hole was filled very quickly, very, very quickly, by a much stronger voice and apparatus than the women's rights movement ever was. And so they were even more limited than they had been previously. And we have to, we know statistically that after conflict in nation building, there is a period, a very small window, where you can shake up all of your kind of social, societal norms, right? And I think Libya is a very good example of a women's rights movement that was willing and prepared to take that on. Lost a lot of women in that process, but that just could not stand up to the reality of the conflict itself, the international community's role to a degree, the fact that it's a very resource-rich and strategically important country for a lot of other countries, and that meant that there was significant amount of manipulation, and a lack of insecurity, a lack of security as a whole. We're not talking only about women, but we're talking about the fact that families who weren't necessarily supportive of women's leadership in the first place were now saying, well, we don't want you to get involved, not because you're a woman, but because it's not safe. And so they had another reason to dissuade women from getting engaged. And I do think that's going to perpetuate. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
So let me, on behalf of Ukraine House and my associates here, thank Alla and Olga and June, and I hope all of you will have a chance to talk to them a little bit afterwards. I think you can see why the future is in good hands. Thank you.
Thank you.
Врятувати світ, ім'ям назвав би твоїм. Зробив би так, щоб все навкруги завжди співало ним і дихало твоїм коханням. Тепер я знаю це кохання. Ти моє вперше і востаннє. Тобі так личить моє.